Okay, greetings everyone. Hi, how you doing? First, a little update. I was gonna be flying to Portugal today to our not yet open retreat center there, and I didn't announce it because I knew it might be delayed, or intuition said it might be delayed, and indeed, the airlines just made their requirements more strict, so I need to have a COVID test result before I can board the plane. Get my test results tomorrow, and furthermore, they require that the test be no more than 72 hours before the flight, which is almost impossible in the United States. But I did find an online service that could do it. So now I'm flying to Portugal on Sunday, arriving there Monday, and we're continuing to set up the retreat center for you guys. We don't know when we'll have a group retreat. Could be the end of the year, who knows? But we will be opening for personal retreats, individual personal retreats, with access to a teacher, in this case me, starting at the end of this month, we believe. So that's wonderful. And of course, we'll keep you posted on how that develops. And if we're indeed opening for personal retreats at the end of this month, there'll be some big announcement about that. Great. Okay, so that's it for that. Now, let's see here. Here we go. So, questions. I mean, I didn't know if I was going to be able to do a video today, but here we are, so that's great. Somebody sent in a message asking, how does the tantric tradition view neurotic or psychotic behavior? And this is an interesting question. Of course, 1,000 years ago, there was no psychology, there was no science of psychology. The tantric tradition was in the process of developing what we might call a psychological model through the teachings on the 6 realms, which were originally teachings on the different possible realms you could reincarnate in. But over time, slowly, it became a teaching about the 6 different non-beneficial psychological states that you could get lost in, trapped in, either temporarily or indeed sometimes for the rest of your life. So in this model, which is a little bit different, by the way, from the Buddhist tantric model, but also very much parallel, in this model, the goal is to be in what's called real human presence, or what we can call real human presence, our natural state, but a state that, at least, post-industrialization, is not the most common state, is not the normal state for humans, even though it's our most natural state. And we get pulled out of real human presence by our conditioning, by our narratives and stories, by our samskaras, one might say by our psychology. And in the tantric tradition, it was taught that when you get pulled out of natural human presence, you're always pulled into one of these 6 psychological states, or non-beneficial psychological states that are correlated with the 6 realms. But in time, this became a fairly sophisticated quasi-psychological theory. Anyway, so how does the tradition view what we now call very neurotic or psychotic behavior? Well, interestingly, it viewed the language that was used back then, and all the way up until the modern period, was language of possession. The word avesha in Sanskrit is loosely translated as possession in English, but it actually has a much more kind of complex and subtle meaning. But anyway, the idea is that you can get, as it were, possessed by your own psyche, by your own psychology, by your own samskaras. And that the language of possession, while it might seem archaic, is actually quite appropriate, because from the point of view of essence nature, from the point of view of the possibility of abiding in your essence nature, to have your mental emotional state totally hijacked by these you know, what do we call them, by these psychological possibilities, is you know, it is in a way losing yourself, right? Just like you can get lost in thought, just like you can get lost in addictive behavior, you can get lost in, as it were, cul-de-sacs of your own psyche or psychology. And hopefully you come back to yourself very rapidly, and but sometimes not. And what can happen is that if you fixate too much in any one of these so-called six realms, then you end up making a home there, and that can become your default state, as it is for many, many, many people. Now, this is a teaching that I'm only alluding to here, because it's a teaching that really requires, for the full download, like a 5-day retreat. I've never taught one of those. Myself, I've done 2-day, 3-day events on the six realms, and those are not really adequate, to be honest. But anyway, the point is that when we get temporarily hijacked or possessed by our samskaras, delusions, etc., we sometimes say afterwards to somebody who we hurt with our words, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean that," which is a telling phrase. If you didn't mean it, who did? So even in the phrase, "I didn't mean that," we have a hint of this notion of possession, that you were temporarily taken over by an aspect of your psychology which is not reflective of your essence nature. So it's actually, perfectly correct to say, "I didn't mean that." It can be a way of declaiming responsibility, of course, but it is, in a sense, perfectly correct. So yeah, different kind of systems of psychology, like someone mentions, internal family systems or Jung's work. They use different terminology to talk about the same basic phenomena. Okay, so in extremely rare cases, somebody can become so possessed by one of the six psychological realms that they lose their humanity. They lose access to their humanity, sometimes for the rest of their life, and until they have, let's hope, a moment of lucidity at the end of their physical life. And so in that case, somebody is said to be fully possessed. Now, this is again quite rare, but it in a sense, this is not what the language implies literally. In a sense, this was really talking about mental illness before there was a language for mental illness. So the states of full possession, in any of these realms, are all correlated with pathological states or states of mental illness that that appear in psychology textbooks, which are constantly being revised because, of course, what we consider pathological as a society is always changing, and it doesn't refer to facticity so much as it refers to values, what we consider unacceptable as a society or not. Okay, so Wendy in the live feed says, "I'm still confused about the tantric view on body-mind versus consciousness." She says, "You say in yoga, body-mind is separate from consciousness. In the tantric view, you say the body-mind is a function of consciousness. Can you explain that a bit more?" Well, yeah. I mean, once you understand this distinction, it's actually very clear that when I talk about the yoga view, sometimes I'm talking about classical non-tantric yoga as represented by the Yoga Sutra. Okay, because it's important to remember the Yoga Sutra was not the product of a enlightened guy. It was actually the product of a whole stream of the tradition, the pre-tantric stream of yoga philosophy that goes all the way back to the Mahabharata, which, even though it's an epic, a legend, a myth, embedded in the Mahabharata were a whole bunch of early teachings on yoga and Sankhya. And anyway, that stream culminated just before the advent of Tantra. That stream culminated in the Yoga Sutra attributed to Patanjali, which is again a document of a whole era and a whole system of thought, not the revelation of a enlightened being per se. Although of course the tradition claimed that the teachings in the Yoga Sutra derive from realized masters. But anyway, the point is that in classical yoga, and this fact is obscured in modern yoga teacher trainings constantly, but in classical yoga, the body-mind is absolutely distinct from consciousness. Body-mind is part of prakriti. Prakriti is inherently problematic, and so the body-mind is inherently problematic. It's not ever called a temple of God or a vehicle for divine consciousness or any of those things. The body-mind is what you're trying to escape from, and consciousness, also called pure spirit, Purusha, is distinct and in so many ways, right? It's not a doer, whereas body mind is a doer in that view. It can't do anything according to classical yoga. Consciousness is absolutely passive. It's a passive witness, and so that's why those traditions encouraged renunciation, right? If your true nature is not a doer, and is this pure witness consciousness, absolutely passive, well, it makes sense to just do nothing, sit in a cave and try and meditate, or in a monastery or whatever. So this is radically different from the tantric view. Now, the tantric view is so influential in Indian culture and spirituality that the difference became obscured as people tried to, under colonialism, they tried to create a modern Hinduism in which everything, all the distinctions were erased, which creates what some scholars call the homogeneous stew, or homogenized stew of modern Hinduism, which is a construct of the past 500 years. But the distinction is super, super clear in the original sources that Tantra was a radical departure from earlier forms of yoga, that taught that the correct way to understand the world and the body-mind is not through the lens of the concept of prakriti, which is unconscious and impure, but rather the world, and indeed the body-mind, were and are manifestations of the goddess, that the whole universe is the body of the goddess. And therefore this human body is like a sacred temple for fundamental consciousness. A fundamental consciousness is distinguished as being that which never changes, whereas everything else is always changing. So your fundamental consciousness, or essence nature, is transcendent of body-mind, but not opposed to it in any way. In fact, the tradition taught this fundamental consciousness manifests as everything, right? So if we call the fundamental consciousness Shiva consciousness, then all phenomena are Shakti, are the goddess, and they're in an eternal dance, an eternal lovemaking, even, if you will, as a kind of metaphor. But more ontologically precise is to say that they're actually two different manifestations of one and the same fundamental principle, that pure consciousness manifests as the universe. Shiva manifests as Shakti. You can also see it the other way around. Shakti manifests as Shiva. And the tradition eventually, at least in the Trika and the these more leftist lineages, they argued for no priority, no ontological priority of Shiva over Shakti. that they're absolutely equal aspects of the infinite one, and the formless aspect, Shiva, and the aspect with form, Shakti. Now, some lineages even just got rid of Shiva altogether and said, look, that implies dualism too strongly, so we say it's all the goddess, and she has these two aspects, her formless aspect, sometimes called Kali, and her aspect with form. This entire universe, sometimes called Parashakti or Paradevi, the supreme goddess. But even there, they're actually, that can wrongly suggest a dualism which isn't true, and so those lineages emphasized one goddess, with these two fundamental manifestations, form and formless. The Krama lineage particularly, and even some forms of the Trika. Okay, so finally then, in Tantra, this formless consciousness manifests as consciousness with form. And therefore, your essence nature, unborn, undying, spacious and open, infinitely pure, because it's free of all need and requirement, it's free of all particularity, that manifests as the body-mind. In other words, the body-mind is a limited expression in form of your formless nature. Now, of course, the body-mind, at least in the conventional use of language, the body-mind is imperfect. The implication here is not that all that consciousness manifests is perfect, except in the deepest spiritual sense it is. But in the ordinary human usage of those terms, the body-mind can't do anything. It can't do everything at once, I mean to say. It has issues, it gets wounded, it sometimes doesn't heal, it decays, all this stuff, which from the highest point of view is absolutely fine. It's absolutely part of its perfection. But again, on the kind of ordinary human use of language, body-mind is always imperfect, and essence nature is always perfect. And yet, one manifests as the other, which does lead us, of course, to the ultimate realization of the perfection of imperfection, that actually nothing's gone wrong and nothing could go wrong, that the universe is meant to be exactly this way, that the body-mind decays and dies, the body-mind has challenges and limitations, that's actually perfect in its own way. But it doesn't mean it's not challenging. It's obviously challenging, But the challenge is resolved in every meaningful way through the realization of the body-mind as the direct expression of your deepest nature. That does not mean that the body-mind is always, aligned with your deepest nature. Meaning to say, the body-mind can exhibit behaviors that it ceases to exhibit once it receives the full imprint, if you will, of essence nature. That is to say, once you're abiding sufficiently in essence nature, the body-mind starts to, little by little, spontaneously reorganize itself to be in deeper harmony, one might say, with essence nature. So some teachers call it receiving the imprint of your true nature in the body-mind, which, you remember, because starting as soon as you could understand language, you were trained out of alignment. Your body-mind was trained out of alignment with your essence nature for most people, for the vast, vast, vast majority of people. So we need to reorient, retrain, and of course go deeper, right? Because it's only as a fully conscious adult that you're able to have a body-mind that can be in, really profound and ultimate harmony with essence nature. And it's not a process that can ever be completed, by the way. I don't mean to say that anyone in existence, as far as I know, ever achieved, absolute perfect, integration and a body mind that could only be 100% in harmony with essence nature. But there I am going against the dogmatic traditional received view, right? Because certainly the tradition argues that there were some people called Mahasiddhas that had perfect harmony and total alignment of body mind with essence nature. I'm just a bit skeptical, having never met such a person. I tend to think of these stories as mythology that encourage us to sort of keep going with a process that never reaches 100% or never needs to, even. As my root teacher said, we're going for progress, not perfection, on the level of body-mind. And that's also a huge relief, potentially. If you really literally believe in this possibility of being a Mahasiddha, then it's quite an overwhelming endeavor. Okay. So I'll go to Ali Maya's question. In what way could you say that all of the heartbreaking events happening in the collective right now are perfect, and in what way are they not? So this question is coming up a lot in 2020, about which we will perhaps have perfect hindsight. We'll have 2020 hindsight about 2020, but it's hard to have that in the middle. But what I want to really emphasize, because so many people have asked about this, I want to emphasize, you guys, that nothing is different about right now versus any other point in history, in the deepest way, but also even in political and social ways. Humanity has always had an incredibly hard time with social and political institutions. And they have always oppressed some people and privileged others, always, always, always. And people have always been unjustly killed. And everything that is bothering you about now, including pandemic, has happened over and 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 over again in human history, usually much worse than the version right now. And what we have, you guys, is an incredibly profound distortion in the lenses we're using to use events, the sources of our information, right? Because in 2020, social media dominates everything. Because most people are getting their news through social media, right? If you can call it news. Is there any such thing as like really fair, unbiased, unpolitically motivated reporting anymore? I don't know, but it's certainly very, very hard to find. And so, in other words, people have the idea, because of social media, which puts a microscope on certain events, that things are particularly troublesome now. Without a doubt, racism was worse in the past in virtually every country you care to name. Without a doubt, unjust police brutality directed at certain demographics was worse in the past. Absolutely, without a doubt. But, and I'm not going to go off on this issue because some of you hate it when I take a long time to talk about this issue, but I do want to mention, this is so important, that systemic racism was so much worse in the past in the US that such killings of innocent people of color were not publicized. You didn't hear about them, right? And now they're publicized, and the reason they have such a wide currency is partially because of social media, but partially also because of a system that's more open to reporting on such things, whereas before they would be swept under the carpet. But the problem is, and it's not just about this issue, it's about everything, you guys, there's this severe distortion whereby you think things are getting worse because they're reported more. Now, Noam Chomsky pointed this out years ago when he said, look, you guys, violent crime has been declining substantially since 1990 in many countries of the world, and hugely in the US, much less violent crime than 20, 30 years ago. And yet people don't know that. Why? Because reporting of violent crime in the media has gone up. Violent crime has gone down. Reporting of violent crime has gone up. So almost every American thinks or just doesn't know that you are substantially safer in American inner cities today than 20 years ago, whatever your color. So you are not perceiving reality accurately due to the way in which you are receiving information. And yes, even a video recording of an event is information. You might say, well, that can't be distorted. No, but the number of such videos that get shared is much higher now, right? And so that leads you to believe the problem is worse when it's not. Okay, so many scholars debate about this extensively, but almost everyone agrees that on average, and maybe not talking about your life, whoever's listening, but on average, the standard of living for human beings globally is the highest it's been in history. Yes, there are countless social problems and everything, but almost every scholar who does the real research in this field agrees that on average, the standard of living is the best it's ever been, and humanity has it the best it's ever had it. Now, that might not be true in 30 years due to climate change. It might all go south. But you see, where people think we're living in a particularly horrendous time, when by almost every measure, you're more likely to be safe and fed properly and well off in the world in 2020 than at any other time in history, or not just 2020, the last 20 years as well. But anyway, global extreme poverty has been declining worldwide up until the pandemic. It's been declining hugely, not just in the U.S., everywhere. Okay, so hopefully and all that's fact checkable, but hopefully I'm convincing you the way you are perceiving events is shaped by media and social media. It's not shaped by reality. Okay? Now, having said that, how can we view these challenging things as perfect? Well, because they're part of a process. There has to be social unrest in order to bring attention to an issue that the establishment doesn't really care to look at. That's always been true for the millennia. So it's all part of a process. Now, are things gonna keep getting better? Maybe not. Maybe increasing population, decreasing access to vital resources, exacerbate underlying issues. In other words, for example, people who are racist are much more likely to express their racism now than 10 years ago. I mean, like, way more likely. And they're likely to express it in actions and words. But American society isn't more racist. It's just that those people who are in a minority, thank God, feel more free to express their odious views. So it looks like it's worse, and it may indeed be the case that exacerbating tensions lead to more violence. But it's unlikely that we would even come within a million miles of the level of violence in the 20th century, right? You didn't live through 2 world wars, so you have no idea how much worse that was for everyone. Plus a pandemic, which was 10 times worse than this one. So a little perspective. I don't mean to chide Ali Maya, right? This is just for everyone. A little perspective, please. You are fucking blessed. And yes, you might be experiencing challenges. Yes, you might be concerned about other people who are suffering. But the suffering isn't worse than at other times in human history, right? And I love history. I read history all the time, so this is why I have a perspective that not everyone has. And I know how incredibly fortunate I am to live in a time where a tooth abscess won't kill you dead at any age that you get it. I know I'm incredibly fortunate to live at a time when my home, my village, or my city won't be overrun and everybody in it slaughtered just because the neighbors decided they wanted our land. Okay? Anyway, I could go on, but let's move on. I hope you understand that this is wider and deeper and more important than any given political issue, right? This is not a political teaching I'm giving now. It's a teaching about how human understanding is distorted by the ways in which it collects and accesses information. Thank you. Maria says, why do you think it is that people want to imagine why do you think it is that people want to imagine that things are so much worse than they are? Well, partially because people love drama, even if they don't admit it, they just they're fascinated, they're captivated by drama, whether fictional drama, allegedly non-fictional drama, or actually non-fictional drama. They're just captivated by it, they're entranced by drama. And most people would rather continue being entranced than be free. That's just the way it is. And people love to feel they're living at a particularly important time in history, even if it's only important for being particularly horrendous. It sort of feeds the ego in a weird way. We're living at such an important time, Now, this is, of course, actually true in some ways because it's probably true that the way that humanity responds to the challenges of the 21st century will determine whether there is a civilization at the end of the 21st century. Humanity will survive no matter what, but they might survive in a greatly reduced number, and they might survive without this edifice of civilization, and certainly without this internet and all this stuff. And that, so the collapse of civilization would be a pretty major historical event. I mean, it's happened many times before, but this would be the first time that global civilization collapses. We have reached we are a global civilization. And if that collapses, then that will obviously be a major historical disjunction, and it could happen this century. And if it does, it will be entirely because of the collective decisions we made and the decisions made by people in power who don't care about the rest of humanity. And unfortunately, there are many such people who are absolutely willing to let the shit hit the fan and the whole thing go up in flames as long as they get theirs. So if there's any legitimate application for the word evil, that might be it. But, it's all part of the pattern also. And Maria says, are humans just drawn to madness? Yeah, of course. You see the evidence for that everywhere. And that's why, for many people, the spiritual path genuinely starts. They might have already been on the path as a hobby, but the spiritual path genuinely starts when at a very deep level you just say, you know what? I'm done. I'm done with this drama. I'm done with this confusion. I'm done with this madness. And I want clarity and freedom and awakeness at any price. And I would rather die than not have it. When that's how strong your intention is, the spiritual path starts unfolding rapidly and powerfully. And finally, Maria says, how can I stop being so triggered by the drama-loving humans all around me? It makes me crazy. How can I navigate it more sanely? Well, it's easier said than done, but the real answer is to stop caring about what they think. Stop caring about trying to convince them otherwise. Stop caring about the fact that they love their drama. Stop caring about the fact that they would rather be, confused and think they're right. Then admit that they don't know, right? Nobody wants to be the one who doesn't know, but that's the spiritually wisest thing of all, of course, to know that you don't know, that you really don't know anything for sure, apart from consciousness exists. That's like the only statement we can make and be sure about it. Maria, it's easier said than done, but like, stop giving a fuck about the things that giving a fuck about doesn't make any difference other than to make you suffer, right? Now, if you make this shift, this is not just ignoring. This is not ignoring your loved ones who, make you crazy. This is, you start to actually smile at them, and not from a place of superiority, right? It's like, oh, I know the truth and you poor fools. No, just like, oh, humans, they just love to argue. They just love to be right, and you just kind of like, you accept it, and you it's fine. It's not, you're making it into a problem when it's not a problem. And of course, if it gets actually, harmful or abusive, then you step away. Okay, now we have more questions. Okay. So Divyam asks, oh gosh, now there's a lot more questions. Would you like to expound on the law of karma in light of the tantric tradition? Does the tradition hold the same opinion as the Vedic one? No, it doesn't. Okay. Number one, your actions have consequences. And even if you're on the path of awakening, your actions have consequences. And so you don't want to act as if they don't. So personal responsibility matters, even though personhood is a construct, a mental and social construct. Still, you, meaning the locus of consciousness events, which has a particular name slapped onto it, in this case, Divyam, or all of you, right? You can behave in ways that facilitate awakening for others, or that facilitate even just the opening of the heart center for others. And you can also behave in ways that make that less likely. And that's the kind of harm that we're concerned with. Yes, of course, it's terrible if you hurt someone's feelings and everything, but ultimately what really matters is doing our best to behave in ways that facilitate heart openedness and ultimately awakening for whoever. And this, of course, should not be done in a way of like, if I behave exemplary and virtuously, then people see how wonderful I am and they'll want to be like me. So don't let the ego hijack it like that, or some more subtle version of that. It's just over and over and over and over and over again. Just take an extra breath, come into your center as best you can, and invite your words and actions to flow forth from your centered state, and ideally from being centered in your ultimate spiritual heart. You just keep inviting that, and then automatically your actions, little by little, tend to facilitate heart opening and awakening for others, even if you don't get to see that, right? The reason the tradition was not concerned, the tantric tradition was not concerned about karma very much, is because, as I've said before, initiates underwent a ceremony that just annihilated all karma other than the karma already in the process of bearing fruit in this life. So they just, because they believed, that they had been freed from all karma except this life karma, it didn't become a subject of frequent conversation. The only question is how are you negotiating the moment-to-moment challenges and opportunities in this life in such a way as to become fully awake, if possible, in this very life, or at least at the end of this life. Which, by the way, to some people sounds like a booby prize, a second rate, that's the silver medal if you attain full awakeness at the end of this life. But it's not true. everyone who becomes fully awake at the very end, even in the last minute of this life, it renders the entire lifetime meaningful and beautiful, even if there horrendous things happened in it, you know? Remember, if you actually become fully awake, you transcend time and space, and the deeper pattern and meaning and beauty of existence is revealed in such a way that you wouldn't say in that last minute, "Oh shit, now I get it. Now I see the truth and I'm gone in a minute. That sucks." No. The opposite of that. It's the opposite of that. So, anyway, just to mention that. Okay. I don't know which questions to answer now. Let's go to the original question thread in the group. Lillian asks, why does consciousness contract itself in the first place and then play the game of trying to rediscover the truth about itself? And this is another question that's come up over and over, and it's just a very hard thing to fully understand. So I don't blame people for asking the same basic question over and over. But what's happening is that people, including almost everybody in this community, still doesn't get that they're framing the question as a question of theodicy, as a question of like, why would consciousness do this to us? Why would it contract and put us in this situation where we suffer only to rediscover what it always already was? Well, it's not really like that, you guys. That is, you're importing assumptions from other religious traditions without even realizing you're doing it. People, imagine the contraction of consciousness into form as a kind of equivalent of the fall from grace or original sin or something like that. And of course, I know that you don't think that. I'm talking about the influence of religious traditions and religious narratives on your subconscious mind. There's no fall involved. Consciousness contracting into form is not like, a choice to suffer. Because there isn't part of the confusion involves also the notion of a God who kind of, in a way planned this. But that's not what the tradition's saying, not in that sense. But I'll try to answer the question anyway. Consciousness contracts into particularity and form for the primarily the joy of self-expression. It's, again, the metaphor is an artistic one. Okay? What painter would paint a painting that's just homogeneous white or homogeneous black with no variation whatsoever? Nobody does that because nobody would want to look at that. Art requires light and shadow. It requires a full palette of colors, right? And when consciousness contracts into the form of a universe, right, that necessarily includes this full range of possibilities in which you ultimately discover supreme, sublime beauty, right? And so consciousness contracts into form out of love for itself and out of the joy of self-expression. Now, in this contracted, embodied state, there's the possibility of not knowing temporarily, not knowing what you are. And that too, that involves consciousness sort of temporarily becoming fascinated by, entranced with a particularity, with a particular body mind. And I'm talking about you in your body mind, right? Do you see me? One infinite consciousness becomes Lillian, becomes Maria, becomes Eric, becomes Divya, and is so fascinated by that experience that it forgets that it's anything but fill in your name. But, so then it feels after a while, and that could be, thousands of lifetimes, but on the cosmic scale, that's a blip. After a while, then it's like, you're like, something's not right here. I think there's more to me than what I think. Or I sense there's more to me than what I think. I'm something more than just this body, mind, mental history, constructed personality. And then the search begins, right? And inevitably leads to realization of your wider nature, as it were, or deeper nature. Anyway, that's a deep topic. I want to also get to some other questions, and maybe we can sometime have a full satsang on just that topic in more detail, because you can look at it at multiple levels. There's different answers when you're talking from an evolutionary biology perspective versus a strictly biggest possible view spiritual perspective, and so on. Maya says, could a spiritual teacher's energy be too strong for certain students, causing them some physical issues? Negative physical issues, presumably. No, this is some fabricated idea that you got sold. Sometimes a spiritual teacher's energy is very intense to be around. It's very powerful, but in the same way that a bonfire that you're too close to is hot. It's not going to hurt you, okay? And then you're like, well, that's a bit hot. I might step back a bit, but there's no, that metaphor breaks down, right? Because you could step closer to the bonfire and get burned, but a person's energy, no matter how powerful it is, if we're talking about an awake person, not a fraudulent person posing as an awake person, it can't cause you problems. But if it is a fraudulent person posing as an awake person, then your system might be trying to signal to you danger from this person. Even though your mind is convinced they're enlightened, maybe your body's saying, maybe not. I don't know. I'd have to know much more about your situation. Nice to be with you all and feel connected to this community. Okay, part 2 of Lillian's question. She says, I didn't have theodicy in mind. Great. Many people do, whether they know the word or not, doesn't matter. They have the sort of orientation of that question. Lillian says, no, that's not where she's coming from. And then she clarifies, I'm wondering because it seems futile to go through all that. If you know the truth, then intentionally lose it so you can find it again. No. So this is what Ken Wilbur correctly criticized, and is in one of his most famous teachings, and perhaps I'm going to offend some Ken Wilbur fans, perhaps the only teaching you need to actually know from Ken Wilbur, who in general, in my view, is someone infatuated with the intellect and an overthinker in 14 different ways. But his pre-trans fallacy is very, very important to understand. So look up Ken Wilbur and the pre-trans fallacy, which is still a needed teaching. which is basically saying, no, the transcendent, transpersonal state of consciousness is not a return to the prior state. It's something different. And the best way to understand this is actually not through Ken Wilbur, but through Hegel's dialectic, of sort of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, where the thesis in this philosophical idea is the primordial state that we or the universe starts out in, which indeed is this pure, undifferentiated state, it's the idea held in the infinite mind of God, or however you want to characterize that. And then there's the antithesis of that, which is a messy world, messy human life manifestation with all its messiness, right? But on the spiritual path, we are not seeking to return to the first state. We're seeking actually synthesis. That's why the tantric tradition emphasizes the possibility of liberation in this body, in this life. Even if you don't actualize that, it doesn't matter, because the whole orientation, let me clarify why I say it doesn't matter, because even if you make a progress on the spiritual path, you're going to be so gratified by that progress. At some point you're like, yeah, I might become fully liberated in this life, I might not, but I'm pretty darn liberated now compared to where I used to be, and I'm very happy about it. So I'm saying it doesn't matter if you kind of reach the most complete possible attainment, because the path is so nourishing even if you tread a quarter of it. But anyway, the point is that the stressing of Jivan Mukti is not so much to say that's what everyone should attain. Everyone should be fully liberated in this body. It's a way of stressing that the goal is synthesis, not a return to the first state thesis. And you can look at this on this sort of cosmic scale, but you can also look at it on the scale of a human life, that in infancy we're one with everything. But we can't appreciate that oneness. We don't have the mature brain, and the mature perspective that would even allow us to appreciate our oneness with the universe in infancy. So we don't seek to return to the infant state of oneness. We seek a radically different thing. Again, a synthesis, right? Thesis, antithesis, synthesis, whereby you now have the oneness, but you also have the perspective. You have the vimarsha in technical language that allows you to appreciate that state of oneness that in a way only an adult can. It's impossible for a child to appreciate their oneness with the universe. So yeah, look up pre-trans fallacy. It's actually hard to find good discussions of how Hegel's dialectic is really applicable to this to spiritual life. But maybe I should write something. It is. I think it's little bit more sophisticated model that's pointing to, in some ways, pointing to the same thing as the pre-trans fallacy. And Daryush in the live feed recommends Michael Washburn's writing and says it's better, more sophisticated than and more clear than Ken Wilbur. So maybe he can post that in the group. Okay. Always more to be said about these topics. Please don't consider that the answer that I give in the office hours video is like the definitive final answer or anything. That some of these things just need a lot more exploration, but at least it's an orientation. Julie asks this question about Paśupati. Now, very ancient name of Shiva as a god. Shiva, sort of more the mythological Shiva, the Shiva of the Puranas, not the Shiva of the Tantras. Paśupati means Lord of creatures, Lord of beasts. Anyway, so she's noting in the Recognition Sutras that this terminology occurs where paśu is used to mean bound soul, a soul in samsara, a soul that not yet awake. And there's not even, can't take the language too literally. Okay, it's not possible to literally be a bound soul. But paśu just is a term used in the tradition to mean somebody who is not yet in the awakening process, and therefore is more likely to be sort of confused and deluded and befuddled. Okay, befuddled like a domestic animal. So that's, sounds like a terribly denigrating term, and maybe it was, but so a paśu is a domestic animal like a cow or a sheep, and that term gets used in tantra to refer to the bound soul, or the unawake being, or the just starting to wake up being who's still quite jud, who's dense. So yeah, it's a bit derogatory, but it could also be used by gurus as a kind of wake up call, a forceful pedagogical strategy. Don't be a paśu, to like try to get people to snap out of it. Of their current state of befuddlement or whatever. So anyway, Julie notes these terms. So here, Paśupati is reinterpreted not as Lord of Beasts, but the principle within consciousness that leads us from darkness to light. Anyway, I think that's probably enough of an answer for now to that one. Murad asks, some traditions, like for example Theravada Buddhism, are promoting to keep a big distance away from desires, and I think and they tend to be celibate in that tradition. Yes, that's true. Aren't they promoting the end of humanity if we don't procreate? Well, I mean, no, because they know very well that not everyone's going to take their advice. People sometimes raise this objection, which I think is an invalid objection of like, well, what if everyone did that? What if everyone heeded your advice? Right, but a wise person knows that not everybody's going to heed their advice, and never in a million years is that going to come close to being a possibility. So, some people have, for example, criticized some statements I make, on my personal page that are political or socially tendentious or whatever, and they'll come to me and say, you have a platform, you have a responsibility, you're saying something that's not, that's too controversial, or that's not, it might have these blowback effects. What if everyone, And see, the thing is, I make statements that are very much sensitive to the size of my platform, which is small, which is actually quite small, right? So, I hate the term followers, but, 8,000 followers, that's nothing in social media. And so, yes, if I had 18,000 or 80,000, I would be temper my words a little bit more carefully, because they could be misinterpreted. And yes, the odds of being badly misinterpreted are relative to the scale of your audience, So I want to be able to say stuff that I wouldn't say if the following, or audience, I prefer to say, was, 800,000 or something. Now, obviously, people on YouTube feel no such moral responsibility. They have millions of followers and say absolutely ridiculous things, or things liable to dangerous misinterpretation. But anyway, yeah, it's the more important question there from Murad is about demonizing desire. Non-tantric traditions, every single one of them, in Asian religious history, demonize desire, and Tantra divinizes desire. Of course, that doesn't mean just do whatever you feel like. It's all good if you desire it. Go for it. No, right? There's a very powerful, beautiful, subtle teaching and many teachings on desire, which I've written about. But it is a tradition that divinizes desire. That's what really strongly distinguishes it from pre-tantric yoga of the Yoga Sutra and from Theravada Buddhism and other forms of Shravakayana Buddhism. There's going to come a time, you guys, and maybe it's soon, where instead of answering, the same questions over and over again, I'm going to want you to, do your homework more. Now, we're going to help you with that. We're going to develop a system for indexing videos topically. We're already doing it now with the help of wonderful volunteers like Glenn and Florentine. But we're going to do it more systematically, where you can search a database and go right to the video of all the videos and stuff like that, But yeah, it's it's not the best use of my time to answer the same questions over. Now, of course, sometimes you guys ask a question in a different way, and that does draw out a different teaching, and that's great. Okay. Backtracking a bit here in the thread, in the live thread, Sarah says, and this is very important actually, surely there's a kind of fine line. there's a problem potentially where not the beneficial version of not giving a fuck melds into totally bypassing the harsh realities that exist for people. Yeah. I would never imply, not giving a fuck about people's suffering. I was talking in the context of, arguments and debates amongst underinformed people, and virtually everyone is underinformed, right? Unless you're an actual full-time political analyst without, a personal agenda, and those people are extremely rare, then you're underinformed, because the world is incredibly complex, because globalized culture is going to be, how could it not be incredibly complex, It's, our brains evolved to deal with the interpersonal challenges of a group of 150 people, right? And so the complexities of global situations and global economics and global political currents involving 7.8 billion people, it's literally not possible that your opinion has anything to do with anything other than parroting the talking points that you've read, that you find convincing. And this is usually on the basis of rhetoric, on the basis of what you words put together in a way you like, not because you have a good sense of the facts of the matter. But anyway, so humans arguing about their tightly held opinions, that's all what you shouldn't give a fuck about. Now, do those opinions sometimes translate into actions that actually harm people? Well, yes, but usually in a very, very small way. Like they might vote for somebody who wants to continue oppression, systemic marginalization of certain demographics, but that's only a concern in a certain context. Like let's say you live in a swing state where it's up in the air who's gonna win that state, and it's up in the air who's gonna win the election. Then then it might matter to really try to win over even just a handful of friends. There's something at stake, in other words. But humans argue until they're blue in the face when there's nothing at stake in reality, or only very, very, very little. And that's a huge waste of mental, emotional energy that you need for other purposes. And Sarah, I want to say, to you and others, look, a teacher gives certain answers to certain people on the basis of knowing them. Like, I know Maria. I know I gave her the right answer for her, right? I'm not saying it's the right answer for everyone. So if there's somebody else who's completely oblivious to how they benefit from systems and structures that are simultaneously harming people, and then the coaching is completely different. The coaching is you need to give a fuck, So there's in the spiritual life, there's very rarely one size fits all answers, and that itself is an important teaching, and we call it antidote your tendency. Depending on the tendency. That's why it helps to be in communication and dialogue with the teacher and community. So Sarah says, not giving a fuck seems to be at odds with the desired motivation to seek only the truth. No, it's not, because because you don't find the truth in endless arguments on social media. There is no capital T truth to be found there. So not giving a fuck about that is it's not incompatible with this injunction to seek the truth. You're not going to find the truth in, red-faced political arguments, right? So yeah, just be careful about taking, not just with me, with any teacher, be careful about taking a statement and kind of extrapolating it to everything, which was not the intention. Just looking at the live feed. Might have to wrap it up, right? So my brain does this, my mind does this thing of like, oh, maybe I'll get to all the questions today, and then at some point it's like, no, that's not gonna happen, is it? Let's see if there's anything else that jumps out. Renee says, seeing and hearing about apathy about environmental concerns is enraging to me. I think it's good to be enraged about that. Well, only you can say. Sometimes rage can inspire and enliven. Other times it's just depleting. And, so it's up to each person to decide. But this issue about apathy about environmental concerns, a few years ago when the UN announced, we all have to do our part to fight climate change. Here's what you can do: turn off lights, recycle, da-da-da. And I realized, it was a huge thing at the time, that the UN, was totally participating in the global rule of the for-profit corporations, because what they weren't saying was the most important thing of all, which is that as much as consumers try to mitigate the effects of climate change with their little behaviors and habits, absolutely there's no chance in the world that climate change will be successfully mitigated to less than disastrous levels unless mega conglomerate global corporations take full responsibility. I mean, we're not even close to that. And so, sure, recycle and turn off lights and everything, but if you think it's going to do anything to mitigate the worst effects of climate change, you're wrong. The only thing you could really do, and it's very little, is put pressure on your government representatives in all countries to put pressure on the corporations to start to take responsibility for their actions, and also not just put pressure, legislate. Governments need to legislate that, for example, corporations that pollute are required to pay reparations for the environmental impact of their pollution, which is far, 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 far more than the consumer base. This is not going to happen in the US, of course, because the corporations literally own the politicians ever since Citizens United. You guys, if you don't know how bad that is, it ruined this country, and it is still doing so. And this is a whole issue. But it's so serious that it gave corporations full power to own politicians, and so there's no chance, as long as that's in place, that the U.S. will do anything about climate change. And now the experts are saying it's a done deal, you guys. We're going to hit 1.5 Celsius for sure, and the consequences are massive, and we could hit 2. It's a done deal. Plan for it. Train your kids to plan for it. Train your grandkids to plan for it. The world in 2050 will be a very, very different place due to massive climate change, which we're just seeing a tiny bit of now. And all those who don't believe that, the deniers, I hope they live. I hope they're all old people in general, but they hope they live. Anyway, just to see how this is going to be a thing. It's going to be the biggest thing ever for those who live to see it. But anyway. And it's not depressing, you guys. Come on, it's just something that's happening. It's happened before. This time humans caused it, but it might be tough on some people. Well, as you can tell, I like going off on issues that are not strictly spiritual per se, but everything actually is. It's all connected, right? Because when you commit to seeing the truth clearly without without the obscuring lens of personal agenda, then you do see certain truths, and then and it ties into everything. It's not, you can't really separate spirituality from anything. And people don't like it. Some people don't like it if I get political, but you can't separate. There are values that awakening, confers. If awakening is integrated to some degree, there are values it confers, and you can't just ignore that and pretend like, oh, it's we shouldn't talk about that. Okay. Anything else? And last thing on that, though, I know people are scared by this idea, but this is why we need global governance. Read what Yuval Harari has to say about it, but it also just makes sense. The corporations are globalized. That's why they can rape and pillage, with impunity, because they're bigger than nations. They're bigger than so national governments can't rein in global corporations. How they can, to an extent, in that country they can, but then the corporation just removes their base of operations, and boom, they just keep doing whatever they want. And yes, they do want to trash the planet for profit. That is not a conspiracy theory. That's the most important truth, which should dwarf all the other shit, but somehow doesn't. Anyway, we need global governance, and we're far from that. Um, do. Okay, maybe we could wrap it up there. Lima says, are you willing to share the text you mentioned about desire? No, I didn't mention the text. The whole tradition, there's not one text on how desire is not the problem. It's a teaching that's everywhere in the tradition, that emphasizes, the problem is never desire. The problem is always ignorance, and often ignorance about desire. So the only thing that makes desire problematic is your misunderstanding of desire. You were referring to my blog post, or a couple of blog posts about it. Yeah, there's one called What You Really Want, blog post called What You Really Want. Maybe check that out. And Daryush says, I'm all for John Lennon's imagination of the world in his song Imagine. But here's the thing, you guys, a tantrika does not make their happiness, joy, freedom, and fulfillment contingent on the world or human culture writ large sorting itself out into some state of perfect peace and harmony, right? Some people don't like this about the tantric tradition, but a tantrika can experience, joy and exultation in seeing Rome burning, as well as seeing it built. So the collapse of civilizations is part of the process. It's the collapse of ecosystems is part of the process. There were 5 great mass extinctions on planet Earth before the current one, and this one doesn't look like it'll even be as bad as those naturally occurring ones. This one's also naturally occurring, because humans are nature. But anyway, my point is, don't imagine that that how do I say this, right? I mean, okay, you can fully support the vision of a more harmonious society and work for it without needing to believe that it should come to pass or that it should be the case. Whenever you're lost in should, you're lost in the mind world and you're not awake. So, yes, tantrikas, exult in life and death. They exult in flourishing, they exult in destruction, because they exult in the pattern of the whole. That doesn't mean they, Anyway, I'll have to stop there. It's a hard thing to explain, and it's something that's easily misinterpreted. The shirt is from India. You're unlikely to find it in your local retail stores, even if they're open. So, Yusuf, my brother in India, Yusuf Mariawala, is my supplier of Indian yogic haute couture, however you pronounce that, sartorial options. I literally arrive in India, and Yusuf is like, "Here, I got you these shirts," and he's great. He picks out great shirts, and he was the first person to find these shirts that have actual Sanskrit characters scanned from handwritten manuscripts, anyway. Somebody puts in the live thread, this is absolutely true. Deep adaptation to climate change is now required since the tipping points have passed. And he says, it occurs to me that the prime preparation we can make regarding environmental destruction is learning and teaching spiritual resilience in the face of whatever may come. Because anything else is a fight against what already is. Well said, and that's what I'm trying to do. Yes, we can still mitigate the worst of climate change, but when I say the worst, most people don't understand that what is inevitable, what's already inevitable, is going to be unbelievably, it's going to be beyond what you can imagine, okay? But still, it could be even worse than that, and that's the part we can mitigate. We could stop 2 degrees instead of 1.5. We could keep it at 1.5. Anyway. Okay, so that's it for now, and nice to be with you all. For those who missed the beginning of the video, I'm flying to Europe on Sunday. There is a little bit of the feeling of escaping a sinking ship not long before it goes under, but anyway, we'll see what happens. Lastly, someone asks, is there anything that can be done to deepen in relationship with the wild tantric goddesses? Well, of course, there's 100 things you could do to deepen you read about them, you study about them, you might then find a teacher qualified to transmit the sadhana or the practice of one of those goddesses. You might, but just start by learning as much as you can about them from sources that seem really solid. Yes, thank you for the good wishes, everyone. I still have a lot to do before I go. I'm taking suitcases of tantric art to Portugal to decorate the place. I hope some of you can come for personal retreat and do some volunteering. We're going to grow our own food as much as we can. We're going to install solar panels. We're going to we need also artists and decorators, because we want to make the place as beautiful as possible, not just functional, because this is tantra. It's not just about functionality, right? This is what makes us different from the Zendo, right? Which some of them are beautiful, by the way. But it's not about austerity. It's about flourishing and beauty and expressing realization in those forms. Yeah. Yes, we have great artists in this community. Eric Jacobson is one of them, and look forward to finding the ways that you'll contribute as well as others. Nick Orion is another great artist. You guys can share your art in the group, especially if it's inspired by the tantric teachings. Share it in the group. That's all part of the path. This is a path that celebrates art and beauty, and again, it's the opposite of austerity and deprivation. Om. I hope to make one more poetry video for you guys on Abhinavagupta's poem before I head out, and we'll see if that happens. One never knows. And yeah, Europe is welcoming people from most countries. except the United States because of the U.S. government's incompetent response to the pandemic. Understandable consequence. But virtually anyone else can travel to Europe, and at some point Americans will be able to come too. So nice to see you guys. Love you all. Hope to hug you all eventually. Perfect. Om